Okay, so let's continue on with our discussion of the menstrual cycle and the hormonal changes that take place and control of these hormonal changes. So this figure demonstrates sort of graphically what's going on during each of the phases of the menstrual cycle, early to mid-follicular, late follicular to ovulation, and then we have early to mid-luteal and late luteal phases here. And we'll be going through each of these figures one by one. The middle graph is okay. It kind of shows the changes in hormones that take place during each of these stages, but we prefer to use the graph with the real data on it, and so that's the one that I'll be concentrating on as I roll through the changes in the hormones as they take place here. Okay, so let's first notice that this is not real data. I'm going to go through the real data with you, and let's begin with this early to mid follicular phase and describe some of the hormonal profile that we see here. So here we're back to our hormonal profiles. Our progesterone way down here, it won't really increase until the luteal phase where it starts to go up quite dramatically. Estradiol down, but very gradually increasing here, and you'll recall this is the follicular phase where estrogen is feeding back and increasing the proliferation of the granulosa cells. So you're increasing your potential to release estrogen here, but it's under negative feedback control really from itself. It's feeding back on the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and that's keeping the gonadotropin levels under control, and that's keeping the estrogen secretion suppressed. Here's our LH and FSH. LH is more sensitive to estradiol, so it's lower here. FSH actually increases during this phase a little bit, and then eventually it decreases as the estradiol concentration builds and as it starts to have a negative feedback effect upon its secretion as well. Okay. Here's our sort of inset figure. We have FSH and LH acting upon the granulosa cells and the thecal cells to increase estrogen, just as I talked about on an earlier video. The estrogen feeds back on the granulosa cells and causes them to proliferate. So the estrogen is going up very gradually, but the potential to generate estrogen going up quite a bit during this phase. And of course, we have negative feedback upon the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, and that's keeping our FSH and LH levels under control. So if we take a look now at our second phase, late follicular and ovulation, here is what that looks like. We have now we have the granulosa cells generating a high degree of estrogen. Eventually that estrogen can't be controlled, and eventually you get a large increase for a sustained period of time. You'll note that causes this feedback to become positive now. And we get our LH surge, which is right here, the open symbols, okay? That initiates ovulation. So we have our high estrogen during this period. It sensitizes the anterior pituitary to GnRH by increasing the number of receptors. So the anterior pituitary now becomes sensitive to GnRH, and so it's going to produce more gonadotropin, release more LH for a given level of GnRH, and then the estrogen stimulates the hypothalamus, the neurons in the hypothalamus, to increase release of GnRH. Combination of these two things helps to generate that LH surge in addition to the factors that I talked about earlier. The FSH goes up, but it doesn't go up as much relative to the initial levels. And this is likely due to the action of activin stimulation rather than that enormous positive feedback that you get that results in the LH surge. So this really isn't part of the LH surge, this increase in FSH. It's not due to positive feedback from estradiol. We then enter the early to mid-luteal phase, and here we have, we're back to negative feedback. So after the LH surge, the estrogen drops quite a bit, and then it increases along with progesterone and inhibin after that as we enter the luteal phase. We get an increase in progesterone as well. So there it is right there. And this is the reason why we get the increase in progesterone. You'll recall we talked in an earlier video about the effect of increasing the density of LH receptors on granulosa cells and how that increases estradiol. That's what's happening here. So we're getting more LH receptors that are being generated, and that sensitizes these granulosa cells to LH. That's causing the conversion of cholesterol to progesterone, which increases the progesterone in the bloodstream. And then that increase in progesterone also feeds into the pathway in the thecal cells where it's converted to androgen, and then the androgen comes back to the granulosa cells where it's converted to estradiol, and that's contributing to the increase in estradiol that we see during this phase. So here it is in all its glory. Here's your big increase in progesterone. Again, this is due to the formation of what's called a corpus luteum. The granulosa cells are increasing the expression of LH receptors, and they're increasing this generation of progesterone. The estradiol levels fall and then gradually rise during this phase. The LH levels, of course, recover, and they fall to a very low level, as does the FSH. And you can see the rise in inhibin here, which is keeping that FSH down as well, and keeping it under control, okay? And then finally we enter phase 4, which is the late luteal phase. This is where your corpus luteum begins to disintegrate and die, and because of that, this is what used to be your follicle. Because of that, the estrogen and progesterone fall. So this is your follicle post-ovulation. It disintegrates and dies. The estrogen and progesterone are no longer being produced, and those levels fall. The negative feedback inhibition upon FSH and LH is relieved because of that fall, and so we get an increase in FSH and LH here. Okay, and that allows you to begin the next cycle where we enter a new follicular phase and the follicles begin to develop. Okay? And here's that late luteal phase where your progesterone and your estrogen are falling because your corpus luteum is finally disintegrating. The corpus luteum was generating this hormonal response. Now it's disintegrating, and those hormones are falling. That's causing your LH and FSH to start to come back up, and you enter a new follicular phase due to that. So let's stop there, and then in the next video we'll go over some of the effects of estrogen and progesterone with particular concentration upon that luteal phase, and then we'll talk just a little bit more about menopause. Thank you.